The most dangerous promises are never written with ink. They are written with loneliness. The rain drifted softly across the floor-to-ceiling windows of Callaway Tower, turning the lights of Manhattan into thousands of trembling stars scattered across the night. 48 floors above the streets below, Ethan Callaway stood alone in his grandfather's private office, his tailored black suit untouched by a single wrinkle, his expression as controlled as the empire he had spent 15 years building. The old mahogany desk still carried the faint scent of cedar and leather, as though the man who had ruled one of the largest investment firms in America had simply stepped away for a moment. But Charles Callaway was gone, and in his place sat a sealed envelope with Ethan's name written across the front in elegant silver handwriting. Around him, the board members, family attorneys, and executives waited in complete silence. Ethan broke the seal without hesitation. He had survived hostile takeovers, market crashes, and betrayals that would have destroyed weaker men. Nothing inside a letter could possibly shake him. At least, that was what he believed. His eyes moved slowly across the page. The room seemed to grow colder with every line. My grandson, if you are reading this, then my time has ended, but your greatest test is only beginning. You may inherit my company, my fortune, and my legacy under one condition. Within 30 days, you must enter a lawful marriage and commit yourself to building the family our name was always meant to protect. Should you refuse, controlling ownership of Callaway Capital will pass to the family trust. A quiet murmur spread across the room. Ethan lowered the paper, his steel-gray eyes locking onto the old family lawyer. This is a joke. The lawyer slowly shook his head. It is legally binding. Ethan let out a short breath that sounded almost like a laugh, but there was no amusement in it. Love had taught him nothing except that people always wanted something. His mother had married for status. His father had stayed for power. The woman he once trusted had walked away the moment another fortune looked bigger than his. Marriage was not sacred. It was negotiation wearing a white dress. He walked toward the windows, watching yellow taxis crawl through the streets like tiny sparks beneath the storm clouds. How long? He asked quietly. 30 days, the lawyer answered. If you fail, you lose everything. Ethan slipped one hand into his pocket, standing perfectly still while the city moved around him. The board members expected panic. His relatives expected anger. Instead, his voice came out calm, measured, almost frighteningly cold. Then find me a wife. Several people looked at him in disbelief. Mr. Callaway, the lawyer whispered. Ethan turned, and for a brief second the reflection in the glass behind him made him look less like a man and more like the lonely king of a silent empire. I do not need love, he said. I need a signature. Somewhere beyond the rain and the city lights, fate was already preparing an answer. Her name was Naomi Carter, and she was the only person in New York who would dare to tell a billionaire no. The next morning arrived wrapped in pale silver light as Naomi Carter unlocked the front door of the Westbrook Community Center, a small brick building tucked between an old church and a neighborhood grocery store in Brooklyn. The paint along the front steps had begun to fade, and the wooden sign above the entrance had survived more winters than anyone could remember. But to the families who gathered there every day, it felt more like home than any luxury apartment in Manhattan. Naomi paused before stepping inside, running her fingers across the brass plaque her mother had helped install years before. Hope grows where kindness stays. Those words had guided her through every difficult season of her life. She had watched her mother build the center one fundraiser, one volunteer, and one prayer at a time, believing that people were worth more than the numbers in their bank accounts. That belief had become Naomi's own greatest treasure. Inside, children laughed as they worked on art projects while volunteers prepared breakfast trays in the kitchen. Naomi smiled and joined them, rolling up the sleeves of her soft blue sweater without a second thought. She carried boxes, poured orange juice, tied a little girl's shoelaces, and listened patiently as an elderly veteran told the same story he had shared every Tuesday for the last 3 years. She never looked at the clock. Kindness did not need an audience. Across the city, however, time was becoming Ethan Callaway's greatest enemy. 29 days remained. His legal team had delivered dozens of carefully selected profiles, each one representing women from powerful families, business dynasties, and political circles. Every meeting had ended exactly the same way. They wanted his fortune, his name, or his influence. None of them wanted him. By late afternoon, Ethan sat alone in his office, staring at another folder while rain traced quiet paths across the glass behind him. Marcus Whitmore, the family attorney, placed a final file on the desk. "There is one more candidate," he said carefully. Ethan barely looked up. "Another socialite?" "No." Marcus hesitated. "She runs a non-profit organization." Ethan finally lifted his eyes. "Then she will ask for money." "Actually," Marcus replied, "she already turned down a donation from one of our foundations because she believed the publicity campaign attached to it was dishonest." Ethan opened the file. The photograph showed a young woman standing beside a group of children, sunlight catching the edges of her dark curls as she laughed at something outside the camera frame. She wore no expensive jewelry, no designer labels, and no carefully practiced smile. There was only warmth. Naomi Carter, 27 years old, community outreach director, graduate of Columbia University. No criminal record, no scandals, no wealthy connections. Ethan closed the folder. "She is not suitable." Marcus remained standing. "She is exactly suitable. She has no reason to chase your fortune." Ethan walked to the window again, watching helicopters drift above the skyline. "Then why would she ever agree?" Marcus looked down at his notes. "The community center where she works is about to close. The building needs major repairs, and funding has disappeared. She has spent the last 2 years trying to save it." Silence settled between them. Ethan understood negotiations. Every person had a price. It was the one lesson life had never failed to teach him. "Arrange a meeting," he finally said. The following afternoon, a black town car stopped outside the old brick building in Brooklyn. Children chased one another across the sidewalk, while volunteers carried supplies through the front door. Ethan stepped out, his polished shoes touching cracked pavement that had probably never welcomed a billionaire before. Naomi was kneeling beside a little boy, helping him tape together a broken cardboard model for a school project. She looked up as the shadow fell across them. Their eyes met for the first time. The city seemed to disappear. Ethan expected admiration, nervousness, maybe curiosity. Instead, Naomi simply stood, brushed the dust from her hands, and asked with quiet confidence, "Can I help you?" For the first time in many years, Ethan Calloway found himself without an answer. Naomi held the front door open as the last of the children hurried outside with their parents, their laughter slowly fading into the cool Brooklyn evening. The community center grew quiet, leaving behind only the soft hum of old ceiling lights and the distant sound of traffic beyond the windows. Ethan remained where he stood, his dark overcoat untouched by the dust and paint that seemed to live in every corner of the building. He looked completely out of place, like a piece of another world that had somehow wandered into hers. Naomi folded her hands in front of her. "If this is about another donation campaign, I already told your foundation no." Ethan studied her carefully. People usually filled silence when they stood near him. They explained themselves. They tried to impress him. Naomi simply waited. "I am not here to offer charity," he finally said. "Then what are you offering?" His eyes drifted across the room. The old bookshelves. The folding tables covered with art supplies. The photographs lining the walls, each one capturing years of birthdays, graduations, and neighborhood celebrations. There was nothing expensive here, yet somehow it felt richer than most places he knew. A business agreement. Naomi almost smiled. "You came all the way from Manhattan for a business agreement with a community center?" "Not with the center." He looked directly at her. "With you." The words settled into the room like falling snow. Naomi blinked once, certain she had misunderstood. Ethan reached into the inside pocket of his coat and removed a simple cream-colored folder. He placed it gently on the table between them. "I need to be married within 28 days. Naomi stared at him. "I am sorry. It is part of my grandfather's will." His voice never changed. Calm, controlled, precise. "If I do not marry, I lose control of my company." Naomi looked at the folder but made no effort to touch it. And somehow that became my problem. Ethan had negotiated billion-dollar acquisitions, but her question left him unexpectedly unprepared. "I was told you need funding to save this building." Her expression softened for only a second before returning to quiet strength. "People told you correctly." Ethan nodded once. "I will cover every repair. The roof, the heating system, the classrooms, every program for the next 10 years. Naomi slowly looked around the room. The cracked windows, the worn floors, The old piano in the corner that only played 6 working notes. She had spent countless nights trying to find grants that never came. Her mother's dream was disappearing piece by piece. And what do you want in return? Ethan pushed the folder toward her. A contract marriage. 1 year. Public appearances when necessary. Complete privacy for both of us. At the end of the agreement, we quietly divorce and go our separate ways. Naomi opened the folder. The first page contained numbers so large they barely seemed real. She closed it immediately. No. Ethan frowned slightly. It was the first genuine reaction that had crossed his face since arriving. You have not read the terms. I do not need to. Naomi stood and walked toward the wall where her mother's photograph hung above the fireplace. A gentle smile rested forever on the older woman's face. My mother spent her whole life teaching me that people are not transactions. Ethan followed her with his eyes, but said nothing. Naomi turned back toward him. Marriage is not something you rent for a year. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument. Outside, the first streetlights flickered on as evening settled across Brooklyn. Ethan slipped the folder back into his coat. Every person he had ever met had a number. Every deal had an opening offer. Yet the woman standing in front of him had refused more money than most people could imagine without asking for a single extra detail. As he reached the door, Naomi spoke again. I hope you find what you are looking for, Mr. Calloway. Ethan rested one hand on the old brass handle, but did not turn around. For reasons he could not explain, her words stayed with him. Because for the first time since his grandfather died, he was no longer certain he was looking for a wife. He was beginning to wonder if he had been searching for someone exactly like Naomi Carter all along. The days that followed passed like quiet waves, but Ethan could not push Naomi Carter out of his mind. Board meetings filled his calendar, investors waited for decisions, and lawyers reminded him that only 25 days remained. Yet every time he looked through another list of carefully selected candidates, he remembered a woman standing in a simple community center telling him that marriage was not something you rented. It was the first time anyone had challenged him without fear. Late one evening, Marcus Whitmore entered Ethan's office carrying another stack of financial reports. He placed them on the desk, but noticed his employer was staring out at the city instead of reading them. The repairs on the Westbrook Community Center have become worse, Marcus said quietly. The building inspector filed his report this morning. They may have to close the doors within 2 weeks. Ethan did not answer immediately. His eyes remained fixed on the lights stretching across Manhattan. Did she ask for help? Marcus shook his head. No. She thanked the inspector and started organizing a neighborhood fundraiser. Ethan picked up his coat without another word. Brooklyn looked different after sunset. The expensive towers faded behind rows of old brick buildings and narrow streets lined with family-owned stores. When Ethan arrived at the community center, music floated softly through the open windows. Inside, volunteers were arranging folding chairs while local families placed homemade food on long tables. Handwritten signs decorated the walls. Save our home. Save our future. Naomi stood near the entrance greeting everyone with the same warm smile she had offered the children. She wore a simple cream-colored sweater and dark jeans, and somehow she looked more graceful than anyone Ethan had ever seen at a black-tie gala. She noticed him almost immediately. Surprise crossed her face, but only for a moment. Good evening, Mr. Calloway. Ethan glanced around the room. You organized all of this. Naomi nodded. The neighborhood always shows up when someone needs help. He looked at the donation table. Small bills. Loose change. A few handwritten checks. People were giving what they could, even when it was very little. This will not be enough, he said quietly. Naomi followed his gaze. Maybe not. Then why are you smiling? She looked toward an elderly woman struggling to carry a heavy tray across the room. Naomi walked over, took the tray from her hands, and guided her gently to a chair before returning. Because they came. Ethan frowned slightly. Naomi folded her hands together. My mother used to say that a building is only wood and brick. The people inside are what make it a home. Before Ethan could answer, a little boy ran toward Naomi holding a broken toy airplane. One of the wings had fallen off. Miss Naomi, can you fix it? She smiled, knelt beside him, and reached into a drawer for a small roll of tape. Ethan watched as she carefully repaired the toy, handing it back as though she had restored something priceless. The little boy threw his arms around her before racing away. No cameras recorded the moment. No reporters applauded. She had done it simply because someone needed kindness. Ethan realized he had spent years surrounded by people who measured value in dollars, influence, and headlines. Naomi measured it in moments. As the fundraiser ended, volunteers began stacking chairs and cleaning the room. Ethan walked toward the old brass plaque near the entrance and read the words carved into its surface. Hope grows where kindness stays. Your mother wrote this? He asked. Naomi nodded softly. She believed kindness was the only thing people could give away without becoming poorer. Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out the contract folder. Naomi saw it and gently shook her head. I already gave you my answer. Ethan looked at the folder for a long moment, then closed it again. I know, he said. I did not come here to ask you to sign. For the first time since they met, Naomi looked at him with quiet curiosity. Ethan was not certain what had changed inside him. He only knew that the cold agreement he had once imagined suddenly felt very small compared to the warmth he had found inside an old community center in Brooklyn. 3 days passed before Ethan returned to Brooklyn, and by then the city had traded spring sunshine for a sky heavy with quiet rain. The sidewalks glistened beneath the streetlights as he stepped out of the car carrying nothing except a folded umbrella and a question he could not seem to answer. Why did a woman who had so little seem richer than everyone he knew? Inside the community center, only a few lights remained on. Most of the volunteers had already gone home, but Naomi was still there, sitting alone at a long wooden table surrounded by stacks of old papers and photographs. She looked up as the front door opened, surprise touching her face before settling into the gentle calm he had begun to recognize. You came back, she said softly. Ethan nodded. I was nearby. The answer was not true, and somehow they both knew it. Naomi smiled without calling attention to the lie. I was organizing my mother's things. The building may not survive another winter, but I cannot let these memories disappear. Ethan walked closer. Spread across the table were photographs worn by time. Children holding handmade certificates. Volunteers painting classrooms. Families sharing holiday dinners. In almost every picture, Naomi's mother stood in the middle, smiling as though the entire world was exactly as it should be. Ethan picked up one photograph with careful hands. A much younger Naomi stood beside her mother, holding a tiny basket of flowers. How old were you? He asked. 9. Her eyes softened. My father had passed away the year before. My mother used to tell me that when life takes something away, kindness helps fill the empty places. The room grew quiet again. Rain tapped gently against the windows. Ethan noticed a small velvet box sitting among the papers. It looked old, its corners softened by years of careful handling. Naomi reached for it almost instinctively. My father gave this to my mother when they were engaged. She opened the box. Inside rested a simple silver ring. No diamonds. No elaborate design. Just a quiet circle of polished metal. Ethan looked at it for a long moment. You keep it here? Naomi nodded. She wanted me to have it one day. Her fingers brushed lightly across the ring before she closed the lid again. She always believed marriage was a promise between two hearts before it was anything else. Ethan looked away toward the dark windows. Promises do not last. Naomi studied him with gentle curiosity. Someone hurt you. It was not a question. Ethan let out a slow breath. I learned a long time ago that people leave when something better comes along. Naomi shook her head very slightly. Then perhaps those people never understood love. Silence settled between them, comfortable and strangely warm. After a few moments, Naomi stood and walked toward the old kitchen at the back of the building. She returned carrying 2 mugs of hot tea. She handed one to Ethan without a word. The steam rose between them like a quiet bridge neither of them expected to build. Ethan wrapped his hands around the cup. No board meeting had ever made him feel uncertain. No negotiation had ever unsettled him like this simple evening. He looked at Naomi and finally asked the question that had been quietly growing inside him. Do you ever wish you had chosen a different life? Naomi smiled and glanced around the worn walls of the community center. No, I have always believed that the right person will value what is inside your heart more than what is inside your bank account. She paused before adding softly, and when that day comes, I want to be able to give that person my whole trust, because some gifts should only be given once. Ethan lowered his eyes to the cup in his hands. She had not spoken with embarrassment or fear. There had been only quiet certainty, a kind of faith he had not known existed anymore. Outside, the rain slowly stopped, And for the first time since his grandfather's letter arrived, Ethan realized that the life he had carefully controlled was beginning to change in ways no contract could ever explain. The following week unfolded with a strange quietness that neither Ethan nor Naomi seemed able to explain. They did not call each other, and yet their paths kept crossing as though the city itself had decided their stories belonged together. Ethan found reasons to visit Brooklyn that had nothing to do with business. Sometimes he arrived carrying boxes of books that an old school had donated. Other times he simply stood on a ladder helping volunteers repair shelves that had been broken for years. The children never treated him like a billionaire. To them, he was simply the tall man who was surprisingly good at fixing bicycles and terrible at painting straight lines. Naomi watched those small moments with silent curiosity. The cold executive she had first met seemed to disappear whenever he stepped inside the community center. One Saturday afternoon, she found him sitting on the floor helping a little girl assemble a puzzle with missing pieces. The child looked up and asked, "Mr. Ethan, why do you always wear black?" Ethan paused, clearly caught off guard. Before he could answer, Naomi smiled and sat beside them. "Maybe because he thinks colors are dangerous." The little girl laughed. Ethan looked at Naomi, and for the first time she saw something unexpected in his expression. Not confidence, not control. It was almost happiness. Later that evening, after the volunteers had gone home, Naomi locked the front door while Ethan carried the last empty boxes into the storage room. The old lights flickered softly overhead. "You did not have to stay all day," she said. Ethan brushed a little dust from his sleeve. "I know. Then why did you?" He looked around the quiet building before answering. "Because this place feels honest." Naomi lowered her eyes for a moment. That is a rare word these days. They walked together toward the front entrance. Outside, the sky was painted with shades of gold and deep blue as the sun slipped behind the buildings. Ethan reached into his pocket and removed the contract folder once again. Naomi stopped walking. He looked down at it for several seconds before opening it. She expected another proposal, another negotiation. Instead, Ethan quietly removed several pages and tore them in half. Then he folded the remaining papers and handed them to her. Naomi looked through them carefully. The financial penalties were gone. The restrictions were gone. The long list of obligations and conditions had disappeared. Only the simplest parts remained. 1 year of marriage. Complete freedom. Mutual respect. Naomi slowly looked up. "Why would you change it?" Ethan answered with complete honesty. "Because I realized I was trying to buy trust, and trust is not for sale." The evening breeze carried the scent of spring flowers through the open windows. Naomi closed the folder. "It is still a contract." Ethan nodded. "I know, and I still believe marriage should mean more than paper." For a brief moment, disappointment crossed his face, but it quickly faded. "Then I will accept your answer." He turned toward the door. "Thank you for reminding me that some things should never become business." Naomi watched him walk away. Halfway across the sidewalk, an elderly woman carrying grocery bags stumbled slightly near the curb. Without hesitation, Ethan hurried over, picked up the fallen bags, and walked her all the way to her apartment building across the street. He never looked around to see if anyone noticed. Naomi stood quietly beneath the old brass sign above the community center. Her mother had once told her that people reveal who they truly are when they believe no one is watching. She looked at the folder resting in her hands, and then at the man disappearing into the fading sunlight. For the first time since he had entered her life, she wondered if the cold billionaire standing behind that impossible proposal had simply been waiting for someone to teach him how to believe in people again. Only 18 days remained before the deadline hidden inside Charles Calloway's will, but for the first time since receiving that letter, Ethan had stopped counting the days. His lawyers counted them. The board counted them. The financial news channels speculated about them every hour. Ethan did not. His mornings began with conference calls in Manhattan, but somehow his evenings always ended in Brooklyn, where old walls carried the sound of children laughing and simple acts of kindness seemed more valuable than the largest deals he had ever signed. Naomi noticed the change too, although she rarely spoke about it. One afternoon, she found him replacing broken light bulbs in the main hallway while 2 teenagers painted over water stains on the ceiling. The sleeves of his expensive white shirt were rolled up, and there was a faint streak of blue paint across one wrist. She walked over carrying 2 bottles of water and handed one to him. "You missed a spot," she said with a small smile. pointing at the paint on his hand. Ethan looked down and almost laughed. I have been told I am better with numbers than brushes. Naomi folded her arms. You are getting better at both. Before he could answer, the front door opened. Marcus Whitmore stepped inside wearing the same calm expression he carried into every board meeting. He looked around the crowded room before quietly approaching Ethan. I am sorry to interrupt. Ethan knew that tone. Something was wrong. Marcus handed him a thin envelope. This arrived at the office. Ethan opened it. Inside were several photographs. In each one, he and Naomi were working together at the community center. One showed her handing him a cup of tea. Another captured them smiling while children played nearby. There was nothing improper in the pictures, yet a typed note rested beneath them. If the board discovers you are risking the company for a charity worker, they will remove you before the deadline arrives. Naomi noticed the color leave Ethan's face. What happened? He closed the envelope immediately. Nothing important. Marcus lowered his voice. Someone inside the family is watching you. Ethan slipped the photographs back into the envelope and looked toward Naomi. She was helping an elderly volunteer fold blankets for the winter shelter, completely unaware that she had become part of a battle she never asked to join. That evening, after everyone had gone home, Ethan walked Naomi to the subway entrance a few blocks away. The city lights reflected across the wet pavement, turning the sidewalks into rivers of gold. Naomi looked at him carefully. You have been quiet all night. Ethan kept his eyes forward. Do you ever wish people would simply let you live your life? She smiled softly. People cannot control what is in your heart unless you give them permission. They reached the station stairs. Ethan wanted to tell her about the photographs. He wanted to warn her that his world was far more complicated than she imagined. But one look at her peaceful expression stopped him. She had spent her entire life protecting others. He could not bring his troubles into her safe place. Naomi started down the stairs before turning back. You know, she said gently, I think my mother would have liked you. Ethan stood frozen as she disappeared into the crowd below. He had faced billion-dollar risks without fear, yet those simple words stayed with him long after the train carried her away. Across the street, hidden behind the dark windows of a parked car, someone quietly lowered a camera and drove into the night, already planning how to make sure Naomi Carter would never become part of the Calloway family. The next morning, Manhattan woke beneath a blanket of gray clouds, and with it came headlines that spread through the business world faster than the sunrise itself. Anonymous sources claimed that Ethan Calloway had abandoned his responsibilities to chase a woman from a small charity in Brooklyn. Television panels questioned his judgment. Financial analysts predicted instability. By noon, members of the Calloway board had demanded an emergency meeting. Ethan sat at the long glass table inside the executive boardroom, while city lights reflected against the polished surface beneath his hands. The same men and women who had praised him for years now looked at him with quiet suspicion. One director slowly pushed a folder across the table. Inside were the photographs. Ethan and Naomi carrying supplies together. Ethan repairing shelves beside neighborhood children. Naomi smiling as she handed him a cup of tea. Is there something you would like to explain? The chairman asked. Ethan looked at every picture without flinching. No. The room fell silent. Another executive leaned forward. The company cannot survive emotional decisions. Ethan closed the folder and stood. Kindness is not weakness. Several people exchanged uneasy glances. The chairman folded his hands together. Then perhaps you should remember that you have 11 days left to fulfill your grandfather's conditions. Ethan left without another word. Across the river, Naomi was completely unaware of the meeting. She was helping volunteers prepare lunch when Marcus Whitmore quietly stepped into the community center. His expression carried a sadness she noticed immediately. Is something wrong? She asked. Marcus looked around to make sure they were alone. Miss Carter, there are people who believe you are becoming a problem for Mr. Calloway. Naomi frowned. Marcus handed her one of the photographs from the board meeting. She stared at it in disbelief. It showed Ethan helping a little boy fix his bicycle while she stood nearby laughing. Such an ordinary moment now looked like evidence in a trial. I never wanted this, she whispered. Marcus nodded. I know. Naomi lowered her eyes. If my presence is hurting him, then maybe I should stay away. Marcus looked at her carefully. He would not want that. She smiled sadly. Sometimes caring about someone means leaving before you become the reason they lose everything. That evening, Ethan drove to Brooklyn as he always did, but when he reached the old brick building, the lights were already off. A small envelope rested beneath the brass plaque by the front door. He recognized Naomi's handwriting immediately. With careful hands, he unfolded the letter. Mr. Calloway, thank you for showing me that people can change. Thank you for helping this place when you never had to. But your future is too important to be tied to my life. I cannot be the reason you lose your family, your company, or your grandfather's dream. Please do not come looking for me. Some people are meant to cross paths only long enough to remind each other what goodness looks like. Ethan stood perfectly still as the evening wind moved softly through the empty street. The community center behind him felt strangely silent without her voice filling the rooms. He looked down at the contract folder he had been carrying in his coat. Slowly, he opened it. Then, one page at a time, he tore the remaining papers into small pieces and let them fall into the night air like pale leaves drifting across the sidewalk. For the first time since his grandfather's letter arrived, Ethan understood the truth. Losing Calloway Capital would hurt. Losing Naomi Carter would break his heart. 10 days later, the grand ballroom of the Calloway Foundation shimmered beneath crystal chandeliers, its marble floors reflecting the golden light like a quiet river. The annual charity gala had always been the most important event on the family's calendar, a celebration of legacy, influence, and power. Reporters gathered outside, investors filled the room, and every member of the Calloway board waited to see what Ethan would do. The deadline hidden inside his grandfather's will would expire at midnight. Marcus Whitmore stood beside him near the entrance. There is still time, he said quietly. If you sign the papers with one of the candidates, the company remains yours. Ethan looked across the room, but seemed to be searching for something beyond the lights and expensive suits. A company was never supposed to cost someone their heart. Across the city, Naomi sat alone inside the community center, carefully placing the last of her mother's photographs into a wooden box. The repairs had stopped after she left. She had accepted that some dreams simply belonged to another season of life. Her fingers rested on the small silver ring that had once belonged to her parents. She remembered her mother's voice as clearly as if she were standing beside her. The right person will never ask you to become less than who you are. A soft knock broke the silence. Naomi opened the door and found Marcus standing outside. Mr. Calloway asked me to give you something. He handed her a small envelope. Inside was a single card with only one sentence written across it. No contracts. No conditions. Just come if your heart tells you to. Naomi closed her eyes for a moment. Then she picked up her coat and quietly followed Marcus into the night. Back at the gala, the chairman of the board stepped onto the stage. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight marks the future of Calloway Capital. Ethan walked toward the microphone, carrying a single folder in his hand. Cameras flashed as the room fell completely silent. My grandfather believed that family was the greatest investment a person could ever make, he began. When he left me his final wish, I thought he was asking me to protect a company. I was wrong. He opened the folder. The audience expected a marriage contract. Instead, they found only blank pages. Ethan looked directly at the board members. I spent my life believing that trust could be negotiated and that love was simply another transaction. Then I met someone who repaired broken toys, carried heavy boxes for strangers, and gave people hope without asking for anything in return. She reminded me that kindness is worth more than power. Without another word, he tore the empty pages in half. The sound echoed through the ballroom. Gasps spread across the crowd. The chairman stood up in disbelief. Do you understand what you are giving up? Ethan smiled for the first time in many years. Everything that can be replaced. At that very moment, the ballroom doors slowly opened. Naomi stepped inside wearing a simple ivory dress that carried none of the luxury surrounding her, yet somehow drew every eye in the room. Ethan walked toward her as the crowd silently moved aside. He reached into his pocket and removed the small silver ring that had belonged to her parents. Marcus had quietly returned it after Naomi left the community center. Ethan held it carefully in his hand. I cannot promise you a perfect life, he said softly. I cannot promise that there will never be storms. But I promise that I will never treat your heart like a contract. Tears brightened Naomi's eyes, but her smile never faded. She placed her hand in his. And I promise that wherever kindness stays, hope will always find us. Outside, the first light of dawn began to rise over Manhattan, painting the sky with gentle shades of gold. The city kept moving, the world kept turning, And somewhere high above them, an old man who believed in family finally had his answer. Because in the end, the greatest fortune Ethan Callaway ever inherited was not a company or a name. It was the chance to love and to be loved in return.